the attempts of all the liberal legal scholars this week to pretend that they could put Trump in prison is the latest bit of liberal leftist inanity as it concerns Trump.
Well, let's go there, because I Robert, you told me on Tuesday, hey, Thursday, it might be good to go down and watch the Trump hearing in person. I went down, got in, and covered it in real time. It was nothing stupendous. My only thing is, watching Bruce Reinhart, the judge, I got the distinct feeling. Magistrate. Sorry, that's right. Magistrate Reinhart. It's clear, it should be clear to everybody, he's got a vested interest right now in making sure that he doesn't come out looking like a highly politicized buffoon who rubber stamps the most unprecedented search warrant in the history of America. So he's got a vested interest right now in controlling how the information comes out, framing it under the pretext of judicial rulings. Okay, I mean, first things first. There apparently the prosecution is going to have a week to submit a redacted affidavit of probable cause in support of the warrant. They're going to go and take out the sensitive information. What's your prediction? I know we might have discussed it, but just refresh our memories as to what you think is and is not going to be found in that affidavit.
So, I mean, I think your description of it after the hearing was apt as to what the magistrate was up to. So that his goal is, how does he cover for himself? First of all, I believe he should have disqualified himself. He should have disqualified himself before he ever issued the warrant. But he should continue. He should have disqualified himself again after the warrant. And he shouldn't be the one resolving the publication of any affidavit in support of that led to the warrant. He confirmed that the affidavit was the sole basis by which he relied upon to give the warrant. But the conflict of interest is still clearly present between he and Trump. He's had to disqualify himself previously because of how egregious this conflict of interest is. This goes to his overt political hostility detailed in social media, his attempts to cover up for Lois Lerner during the IRS scandal. We'll be dealing with another IRS case a little bit later in the show. This goes back to his Epstein connections and whether there was corruption connected to how he handled that case. All of that, he should have disqualified himself. He doesn't. It's not clear that Trump or anybody for Trump appeared, I believe, right? You didn't hear
saw nobody appeared. I saw his attorney, Christina Bobb. She was in the gallery, not making any representations or appearing on behalf. Journalists were all trying to get a soundbite from her, but he had no counsel appear to make any representations.
So yeah, and it would have been better maybe if that had happened, but that ship has sailed. It's what you described, I think, is correct, that he is looking to disclose enough so that he doesn't look like he's covering up the basis of it, while not having the disclosure that would embarrass and suggest he definitely had no such basis. So I think you're going to see one of our locals board members put up a unredacted version and a redacted version. And the unredacted version is that Trump is innocent, and the redacted version takes out all the keywords that show he's innocent to make him look guilty. It was a great little meme. But I think that's what we're most likely going to see. Now, there isn't any legal basis that I can find for the warrant. The Espionage Act claims are ludicrous. The Defense Act claims are ludicrous. The main basis is clearly around the idea that these are either presidential records or that they're classified or both. The problem with that, this is where Amy Berman Jackson comes back to haunt the Democrats. So Judicial Watch in the late 1990s, early 2000, I think it was 2000 they brought suit, or 2001, after Bill Clinton left, they wanted certain documents that Clinton had. Apparently, they're in his sock drawer and places like that. That classic Clinton. The case goes under the Freedom of Information Act. It goes to Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who presided over the Manafort case, over the Roger Stone case. If you want to see what kangaroo courts look like, hers was a pretty good one to watch. Not as good as the judge that presided over the Alex Jones case. That's an all-time classic kangaroo court, but it's of the same temperament. Well, the Judicial Watch's argument was these are presidential records and that are governed by FOIA, that are in the National Archives custody. And the fact that Trump has personal custody, or that Clinton had personal custody over him, didn't change that for FOIA purposes. So she had to find a way to say that Clinton didn't have to turn it over. So what does she say? And she's right about the law on this. The Presidential Records Act was designed to govern people who are not the president. designed to govern everybody else. That same with classification rules. They're designed to govern everybody else, not the president. The unelected don't get to dictate to the only elected executive official how those laws get implemented. So her interpretation, never been challenged since, is that a president can unilaterally decide what is a presidential record versus a personal record. The legal consequence of that is the Presidential Records Act says this law does not apply to personal records. So they're not official records, they're not government records, they're not defense records, none of it. If they're personal records, the question is who got to decide that. Number one, number two, are there any formalities that were required? And number three, was that decision reviewable? The court said nope. Said this decision is exclusively in the custody of the president. His decision doesn't have to meet any formality whatsoever, and it's utterly unreviewable by anyone. Not reviewable by subsequent presidents, not reviewable by Congress, not reviewable by the courts. Based on that means Trump had the unilateral, exclusive right, non-reviewable right to declare any document he wanted personal records, which means the Presidential Records Act has no application to this, and a claim that these are government records is nonsense. The second issue is classification, which we already discussed, which is reaffirmed in that case and other cases, that the president, again, unilaterally determines what's classified. Congress can't override it. Subsequent presidents can't override it. It's once he decides it's unclassified, end of the story as it relates to his records and his possession of them. So all they had was the president's personal unclassified records that they raided in the name that the archivist was entitled to them when legally he was not.
This is what I think we need to flesh out here, because Nate Brody put out a video. I know people might not like his politics or some of his assessments, but he puts out a video breaking it down, just explaining in law, under the current explanation in law, how this can all be justified. And, the pundits are going with this now. Classification versus declassification is irrelevant. The argument is that he had government records, refused to return them despite some requests, which thus justified the issuance of a warrant to raid the president. I said, okay, let's set aside the classified versus declassified argument. Let's just say for the time being, it's irrelevant. They were all declassified, or they were not classified for the, to begin with. Although they said they were as the basis originally with the fake news, but whatever. Let's just say none of them were. Classification is not an issue. They were presidential records that he was bound to return. Robert, so what you're saying here is basically he decides what's a presidential record and what isn't. That's what the Presidential Records Act says, so that when NARA, the National Archive Registration Act entity, says, we want those back, they're ours, and he says no, well, they get the final say, and then they go to the authorities. And the argument would be whatever body governs NARA or administers NARA says, those are ours, they're not yours, give them back. He says no, they get a raid. Even if that's the argument. Now we've moved past it was classified top secret NSCI or whatever it is. They were ours, he refused to give them back, so we raided him. Even if that's the case, how can that be justified to issue a warrant by Reinhardt?
Well, and the other problem is just they can't get around the Clinton precedent. How is it that Judicial Watch could not even be entitled to those records or to see them or to engage in in-camera review, but the FBI is entitled to a raid, right? I mean, that's the problem. That the Presidential Records Act, this is an attempt to elevate the unelected bureaucracy over the elected president. This is a continuation legally of a deep state war, independent and separate from whether deep state actors were trying to get deep state documents that made them look bad. This is legally attempting to say the bureaucracy has more power than the elected branch. The bureaucracy has more power than the people. The bureaucracy gets to control and determine what is a presidential record and what isn't. The National Archivist isn't elected by anybody. A political hack, that's clear from all his records, shouldn't be in the National Archives. There's a continued everybody politically weaponizing their bureaucratic position of power for politicized partisan purposes. He should be removed from office just based on his course of conduct in this proceeding, but also just his overt political bias and prejudice that's so over the top he can't even contain it. But the problem they can't get around is that judicial ruling, unless they're going to say that court was always wrong, in which case it's going to be, why didn't you say anything about it for 20 years? Not only that, if these were government records, Barack Obama committed over 30,000 federal crimes. Bill Clinton committed tens of thousands of federal crimes. Jimmy Carter committed tens of thousands of federal crimes because they all took records that the archives considered presidential records that they either did not or said they wanted custody over, and the archives could just come in later. So that's the problem they have. And so people trying to defend this have to deal with the fact that it's never been applied this way before. There's no court that's ever interpreted it that way before. The plain language of the law and our constitutional separation of powers rebuts and refutes their argument. That's the problem they have.
My bigger problem is, let's just even say it's a violation of the Presidential Records Act and he has to give them back. Why wouldn't you just? There was no risk unless we see something in the affidavit.
Oh, I mean, they're going to try to claim there was risk that someone else would see the records. The records will be destroyed. I'm sure there'll be some allegation of that. And there was ongoing discussion about what normally happens is the president takes a whole bunch of records with him. He wants them for his presidential library. The National Archives can designate his presidential library as part of the National Archives, and they decide what they're going to allow to be labeled a presidential record for the purposes of National Archives custody. And there's money issues involved and a range of other issues involved. Everybody takes these records with them. And so they can't get around the historical. Not only is it utterly unprecedented to raid a prior president and future presidential opponent, a lead opponent, that's never been done before. But it's requiring, again, it's always with these cases with Trump, requiring ridiculous interpretations of the law that go against the policy behind the law, that go against the constitutional framework that governs the interpretation of the law, that goes against historical custom and practice, that goes against established legal precedent. And that's the problem they face. So, I mean, I agree that on top of that, even if these were government records, a search warrant is ridiculous. There isn't probable cause for probable cause, they needed to show that they had evidence that Trump knew these were presidential records, not personal records, that Trump knew he didn't have legal right to custody over them for any period of time, and that Trump intended to use them in some manner that led to actual sabotage. In their mind, you're trying to undermine the deep state. That equals espionage. That equals sedition. This is the problem. They're trying to establish a legal precedent in America where the deep state governs, unelected bureaucrats govern, our constitutionally elected officials don't.
And it's a matter of fact. Whether it was known for 17 months, it was known from at least February 2022. Washington Post reported on it. So they're saying we've known that he's had these for 7 months, and now we're getting a raid on the basis of some urgency, as opposed to going through civil remedy. Or, I mean, what would have been a less intrusive criminal remedy? Just press charges and say, give it back to us, and if you don't, criminal contempt?
Well, I mean, if you really thought they were government records, and that you thought you were entitled to them, and that's the extraordinary thing. Someone who thinks they have a right to override the president. Based on what? There's no law that supports that. There's no constitutional provision that supports that. No custom and practice that supports that. No legal precedent that supports it. In fact, it all rebuts it and refutes it. So aside from that, critical foundational point, that you can sue to get back the documents if you think you're entitled to them. Right? You can bring a civil action and claim these documents actually are president to have them designated. The reason why they didn't is because they would lose the suit based on existing precedent. So they had to pretend something else and escalate. Now, the other reality is they're not really. This is just cover. These are fig leaves. What I said from the get-go, there's been mounting evidence of based on who it's come out partook in the raid. What's been happening to some of the evidence in the records in the raid, what was actually kind of being sought out for by Paul Sperry has detailed this. Others have detailed it. Newsweek has detailed it. So what I said from day one was this was a deep state raid to grab documents that are embarrassing to the deep state, that are exculpatory for Trump, inculpatory for the deep state. And their goal isn't to give them to the National Archives. Their goal, number one, is to get them out of Trump's hands. Number two, probably to destroy them. And so, the inventory was so vague. We'll see what happens. They illicitly seized his passports. They had to return those. Illicitly seized a bunch of attorney-client records. They're having a taint team, and they're trying to fight the appointment of a special master to review those.
This is it's what they did with Project Veritas, and it's absolutely analogous, mutatis mutandis. Project Veritas, an allegedly stolen diary, 6 o'clock raid, steal cell phones, gather the information, oppose the appointment of a
Special master.
special master. They nonetheless then appoint a special master, but they know damn well that they have access to the same illicit information through other means. It's the same mutatis, like they tried it out. Oh, and they leaked to the press. So you got your press running nuclear document stories. You got your press running all sorts of fake stories on the side while they go ahead and do this. They tried it with Project Veritas. Nobody cared. They tried it here. They thought they would get away with it.